We're starting in Matthew 16. And what's
16
kind of
or 15?
16.
16.
And what's 15 we did last week?
That's right. That's right.
And what's interesting is like what we saw in chapter 15, where some of the Pharisees and the scribes were coming up from Jerusalem to challenge Jesus. Now we actually see two groups. So again, understand, Matthew's writing to an audience of Jews. It's not chronological order, okay? So when you look at, and I don't know how much you know about the scripture, Aaron?
Yeah.
Is that right? I don't know how much you know about scripture, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what they call synoptic gospels. In other words, they kind of repeat the same stories over and over again, where the Gospel of John doesn't. Specifically, I mean, there was one miracle in feeding the 5,000 that is recorded in all four Gospels, and we just got finished covering that in chapter 14. But what happens here is the Pharisees and the Sadducees, starting off with verse 1, come to test him, Jesus. And they ask him, we need a sign from heaven. Okay, now this sign is not just a simple miracle. Okay? They were wanting to see Jesus do something that really demonstrated that he was the Messiah. I mean, they wanted something really powerful. And that was the kind of sign. Interesting, the word sign is also the same sign that was used with the shepherds in Luke, when it says, behold, and you will see a sign that Jesus will be in a cradle, in a manger. And this will be a sign. And so, it was something significant. So this word sign means it's more than just the miracle. Because, I mean, he's been demonstrating miracles. He's been casting out demons. People are walking. People are seeing people. I mean, it's just unreal.
And they've been around him the whole time, too.
Huh?
They've been around him.
Yeah, and they've been around him. So now, understand, he's up above Galilee. So what they're doing is they've traveled 120 miles to go meet this guy. Because, I mean, this is about his second year in ministry. Jesus most likely served, his ministry was about 3 years long. He probably started, again, there's nowhere in Scripture that actually says that Jesus was 30 years old when it started. But there was we can see through Scripture, we see that his ministry was basically through a 3-year period of time. And the references to different people in history, such as Herod, the son of Herod the Great, we can see what time frame that is. So that's why they say that Jesus was around about 30 years of age, and his ministry was about 3 years. But what happens is these guys come up now. The Pharisees and Sadducees were just totally opposite. It's kind of like Democrats and Republicans. They did not get along with each other. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. You died, earth, dust to dust, bam, that's it. That's, no doubt. Pharisees, yes, there is a resurrection coming up. Okay? And so they read the Scripture, and again, the Scripture is the Old Testament.
I was thinking Pharisees and scribes. That's different.
This is different, because scribes, that's a good point. Scribes were ones that actually would take the Scripture and rewrite it over again. And they would methodically rewrite the Old Testament over and over again. But at the same time, at this period of time, there was also what they called the Septuagint, okay, which was the Jewish writings in Greek language, okay, and that started around right after Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great with the Greek Empire ruled, and so that's where a lot of people learn either to speak Greek or learn to speak Aramaic, okay. So when you sit there and you say, well, you look at Scripture. And if you go back to the oldest text that you can find, which again is more of a handout, you'll find that those texts from the New Testament is mostly in Greek, okay? But most likely Jesus spoke either in Hebrew or Aramaic, okay? We're going to study about Peter. The Aramaic name for Peter is Cephas, okay? In Greek, it's Peter, or Petros. And we'll get into that in a second. But anyway, the Pharisees and Sadducees, so a scribe was one that is actually sits down and just they were kind of like the lawyers in a sense.
Okay.
They wrote it out, they knew it, stuff like that. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were like two religious groups that really didn't have different opinions. It would almost be like, I don't know.
But they were both Jewish.
Huh?
They're both Jewish.
They were both Jewish. So it would be like, somebody from a Methodist church and somebody from a Baptist church, and they're not agreeing on the different types of baptisms or not. You know, it's just like, but it got to the place where it was really confrontational. But yet, the council that you'll eventually see when Jesus is brought before the Jewish council, it had both Sadducees and Pharisees in it. Because again, they were both Jews. They just had different opinions and stuff like that. But these guys who normally don't get along with each other, they were united because they have had enough of what Jesus was doing. And they've heard about his miracles and everything else. And a lot of things he was teaching was just counteractive and really was putting them down. Because basically, as we saw last chapter, he said, hey, look, why do you live with the traditions of men and forsake the law of God about how you treat your parents, but then you're going to sit here and create some tradition so you can avoid God's law. And so, he was pretty blunt with these guys. And so they come to test him, and they asked him and show him a sign from heaven. So he responds. And I love this, because this, I didn't, until I started reading the scripture, I didn't realize, I always heard the saying, red sky morning means what? Sailors take morning, red sky at night, sailors delight. Well, you're going to sit here and see this, but it don't have nothing to do with sailors. So Jesus says to them, when it is evening, you say, well, it's fair weather because the sky is red. In the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. How do you know to interpret the appearance of the sky, but yet you can't interpret the signs of the time? Okay? And so, what Jesus is saying, hey, look, you're great as far as knowing all, and it's kind of interesting, that same scenario of how we study how we recognize storms coming and everything else has been going all the way back to here. And so, but Jesus is basically saying, you can tell the signs of the seasons, which, remember in Genesis, it says, hey, that's what the stars and the moons and everything else is to help do that. So you can recognize all that stuff, but yet you can't recognize what God's doing right in front of you. And yet you might have known the scripture, but you still, just as Paul's pointed out in the past, they know the scripture, they know the term, even when the kings, 3 wise men, or however many wise men it was, but when the wise men came and said, where is the religious city? Oh, it's in Bethlehem. They know the scriptures, but they're not seeing it. They're totally blind. And that's why, Jesus said before, all they are is a bunch of blind guides leading blind people into a pit. And so he goes on in verse 4, he says, an evil and an adulterous generation. Now, the adulterous generation is not about just sex. What do you think the adulterous generation represents?
Any kind of sin that's against God.
Yeah, it's an adultery against God. When we start, we're supposed to love God. I mean, that goes all, especially for Jews. They already knew Deuteronomy 6:4 is called what? The Shema.
Oh, the Shema, yeah.
It's called the Shema. They knew, love the Lord your God, with all your heart. So, but, when they sit there and they know that's what God demands. And yet they start falling off after traditions, or they fall after other little idols or their own personal interests and everything else. They become an adulterous generation. Because what happens is that they're taking the love that they should have for God and putting it towards something totally different. It says, so you evil and adulterous generation, seek for a sign, but he'll repeat this because he's already said this once before. But no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah. And so he left them and departed. Now what was the sign of Jonah? We talked about this. Remember?
3 days in the belly of a whale.
Yeah. And so what's going to happen is Jesus is going to be in the grave for 3 days until he reappears after from dying. And so that's what, we discussed this before, because this was, I think it was in Matthew 12. When we studied this, he once said that also, and I'll read it to you. He says, for the scribes and the Pharisees said to him, teacher, we want to see a sign. And he answered and he said to them, you evil and adulterous generation, you crave for signs, yet no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah the prophet. For Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So, he just, he tells it is. He's frank with them. He's not mean with them, but he's frank with them. And so he just says, okay, and he just gets up and he leaves. He departs from them. So when the disciples had reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread with them. Now, what was the bread that we're talking about?
What was it?
Huh?
Did you say what was it?
No. What bread are they talking about?
They're talking about raised bread.
Well, but they're also talking about the bread that they picked up from the 4,000.
Oh, from the feeding.
From the feeding. Okay.
The leftovers.
Yeah, the leftovers. And so they had forgotten to bring. Maybe they gave it all out, or maybe they had put a little bit with them. I mean, if you go to a restaurant, you say, "Hey, I need a to-go box," or can you fill up my cup of tea and stuff like that. And all of a sudden you get up and you walk out. And,
Baskets full of it.
huh? That could have 7 baskets, but they probably gave it away. And probably what happened, but they forgot to bring any bread with them. So Jesus turns around and just says this: "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Ooh, now what happens is they begin discussing among themselves, saying, we didn't bring no bread. But Jesus was aware of what they're saying, and he goes and he says this to them. He says, "O ye of what? Little faith." You constantly see this as a constant reminder. It's like what we saw, yesterday with the Gentile woman way up in Tyre. She didn't care if you called her a dog or not. She knew who Jesus was. She had the faith, and Jesus says, "Hey, this is commends her for her faith." But Peter, he sinks in water. "Oh, you of little faith." Again, here it is, and so you're going to understand what he's going to say here and why he's saying that. Excuse me. Why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you yet not perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand what I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So, and Paul, you keep saying this over and over again, and it's probably true. It's kind of hard. We sit there and we read and go, man, these guys are a bunch of doofuses. Jesus is saying, hey, look, stop worrying about the day-to-day things. Stop worrying about where you're going to get your bread from, where you're going to get the money from. You're going to see this later on with a coin and taxes and everything. It's just like they're always caught up in the world. And Jesus said, hey, look, I need you to break away from the world. I need you to understand God can take care of anything. Do you not remember the 5,000 and how we fed them? Do you not remember the 4,000 and how we fed them? Why are you worried about where we're going to get bread? And so he says, what he's talking about is the leaven. And what's leaven?
Almost like yeast.
Yeah, it's yeast. And what does yeast do?
Makes it rise.
Yeah, it penetrates the dough. And so it helps the dough to rise. And so what he's talking about is this little bit of leaven, which is evil, in this considered situation, is evil. And in a sense, what happens is that little bit of nonsense gets in and it just expounds and grows out. And so verse 12, and so they